My son used to work at Buckingham Palace. Not for very long, only in the holidays. And during the whole of the time he was there, he never saw the Queen. But he learnt lots of really interesting information. And one of the things that he discovered, lots of people told him, you know, the Queen has really got a strong sense of humour. But of course, protocol doesn't allow her to show it very much. But sometimes she manages to reveal just how much humour she really has. And apparently, when they have the big state banquets with all the glittering glass and silverware and a huge long dining table set for 100, 150 guests, kings, presidents, ambassadors, lots of important people. And they all come in and they take their drink and they stand at one end of the big dining hall. And they see that at the other end there's a throne. So quite naturally they all stand there talking, looking towards the throne, waiting for the Queen to appear through the door next to the throne. What they don't know is that behind them there is a bookcase. And that bookcase is a secret door. And when everybody has gathered and they're all looking in one direction, waiting for Her Majesty to appear, the door will open behind them and she will stand there without saying a word until eventually somebody having a drink they'll turn around and they'll say to the next person, and the whole room gradually falls silent and they all turn in the other direction where she's standing. And then when she's got their attention, she walks through up towards the throne. What a fantastic way to make an entrance. What a brilliant start to a banquet. Now, sometimes people can do that when they're telling a story, particularly when they're telling a story about themselves. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Hollywood legend Gene Kelly, the dancer, the singer, the actor, the star of so many films going through the 30s, 40s, 50s. One of my friends, if he wanted to, used to be able to start a conversation with a complete stranger with the words, "The first time I had dinner with Gene Kelly," usually he wouldn't get any further because they would say, "You had dinner with Gene Kelly?" "Yes, I had dinner with Gene Kelly lots of times. That's not what I'm trying to tell you. But you had dinner with Gene Kelly?" Yes, I had dinner with Gene Kelly, but that's not the main point. He'd have to then stop and explain why he used to have dinner with Gene Kelly so many times. Why is it important that we make introductions that grab people's attention? Well, the psychologist gives speakers a piece of information which is very depressing. And that is, they say that in the first 15 seconds of a speaker appearing on the stage, the majority of people have already decided whether they're going to listen and take any notice of anything the speaker says. It's not that we're bad speakers. It's not that you're a bad audience. It's the way in which the human mind operates. All the time, the brain is receiving so much information that it hasn't got time to process in a rational and ordered fashion. And so it takes shortcuts. And so what happens is you sit there and you look and you see me come on stage. You're picking up all the time. How old am I? What gender I am? What am I wearing? How am I standing? How do I move? You're not aware of any of that. But there is this inner assessment going on all the time. Am I going to take any notice of this guy or not? It's one reason why I started talking about Buckingham Palace. I thought, let's get your attention from the word go. I could have pulled a glass of water over my head. That would have done it. But now I have your attention, I want to use it. We know that the brain makes shortcuts. We know that we communicate in certain ways that can vary depending on the people we're talking to. Imagine you meet a good friend in the street. You haven't seen them for quite some time. Think of how you will react to them, the words you'll use, the posture you will adopt, how close you will be to them, the style in which you speak. And then compare that with a complete stranger who comes up to you out of nowhere and asks you directions to the nearest station. The way in which you will behave to an observer will be radically different. And if we break down communication, human communication like this, rests on three things. First of all, the words that we use, the verbal communication. Secondly, of course, there's body language. Body language is important, and all the time we are absorbing what goes on. But there's something which is far more revealing. Because you can be careful about the words you use, and you can modify body language. But the third form of communication is extremely difficult to control. And that is what's called paraverbals. Literally, in English, the things which go alongside speech. The speed at which you talk. The pitch. The frequency with which certain words are used. The volume. Hesitation. Filler words. All of this changes according to the situation that we're in and the people that we're talking to. And yet, the brain is capable of absorbing all this information and making a judgment. So there are some people you will meet at a party. And at parties, you can have almost identical conversations, can't you? You come up to somebody who's a stranger, they say, how are you, where are you from, what do you do? You know, all the usual sorts of questions. Sometimes, if I'm in the right mood, I deliberately sabotage all of that to see what sort of effect it has on the person I'm talking to. They don't normally like it. But to an observer, you could have an almost identical conversation with two people. And the first person you come away from and you think, oh, what a lovely person. I really like them. I hope I meet them again. And the second person, you think, oh, gosh, I don't like them. I hope I never see them again. There's something about them. Oof. And yet, if you looked at a record of what was said between you, an observer might say, well, it's almost identical. But you're picking up cues from body language and from paraverbals, which you are interpreting all of the time. Now, most of this is culturally based, but from one culture to another, body language and paraverbals is often quite similar. It's something, of course, that actors, really good actors, know how to exploit. And I was explaining last night how I was lucky enough to see a very famous actress on stage in London. We're very blessed in London. We have 240 plus theatres. So you could go out every afternoon and every evening and see so many different plays. And I was explaining how at the beginning of the second act, the actress came on into the middle of the stage and she stood there for 3 to 4 minutes and never said a thing. She hardly shifted her weight. But from the tiny changes in her body language, I could tell that her character had changed her mind 3 times. That's impressive acting. Those are the sorts of cues that we pick up. But as I say, paraverbals are even more revealing because we cannot control them. Theatre directors know this. So if they're rehearsing with actors, they will give them perhaps a sheet of prose. So the verbal content never changes. They will sit them in a chair so they have no chance to alter their body language. And they will say, read this to me as if you're sad. Now read it to me as if you're angry. Now read it to me as if you're tired. It's not the words, it's not the body language that changes, it's the way in which we say things that are so crucial. The police know it. So if they're investigating something and they're interrogating a person, they will keep coming back to the same point. There is something when I ask him this question that he is not revealing. So let's come back to it again and again and again until he does reveal the truth. I used to teach postgraduate doctors. I'm a physician, or I'm retired now, but I was a physician, and I used to teach postgraduate doctors. And with patients' consent, we used to film consultations. And sometimes I would turn the sound off. Let's watch the body language of the patient. Look, he's disagreeing with you there. How do I know? Or sometimes I would leave the sound on, and I would say, I'm not interested in what the patient is saying with their mouth. I'm interested in the way in which they're communicating in other ways. Sometimes someone will sit there and say, I am not depressed. But their paraverbals are screaming at you, I am so depressed. Can be vitally important if you're assessing somebody for their suicidal risk and they're trying to convince you that they will not attempt suicide again. You have to watch these things very carefully and make sure you get it absolutely right. Why am I talking about these things? Because they are so vital to the way in which we communicate. If you think about reading a book, let's say, of course you can't apply verbal things to it. But I want to get you thinking about the books that you read. Why do you choose them? Is it the cover? Is it the title? Has somebody recommended it to you? Hopefully it's not because it's been on a recent prize list, because the prize list books are usually not worth reading. Is it the characters? Is it the theme? What is it that attracts you? And if you look back over books that you've read for the past year or two, do you find that you're going back to the same style, the same themes again and again? If you read an excerpt from the book, what is it that appeals to you and grabs your attention? My son's now a television producer, and if he watches for himself, not professionally, if he watches personally a television series, he has a 3-program rule. If I can get through 3 programs and I'm still interested, I'll carry on. If I get to 3 programs and I think I could not care less what happens, forget it. The same is true with films. Sitting watching a film with him can be a nightmare because he starts dissecting all the camera techniques and explaining them to me. Thank you very much. But he will sometimes sit and look at the first 2 minutes and say, no, this is going to go nowhere. I'll tell you now, how they're setting up the plot and the characters is not worth carrying on with it. Okay, sometimes I watch a bit further to see, and he's usually right. The same is true with books. I don't know about you, but I've certainly read the first chapter, second chapter of a book, and I thought, I do not care about these people anymore. That's it. I'm not wasting my time on this. Zolly pointed out earlier on that we could observe our reactions to our imagination and of course to reading. How do we react? Is there a common way of reacting to the books that we tend to read? Is it rational? Is it emotional? The themes that we choose, do they resonate with our experience, our interests, our inquiries, our aspirations? I don't know about you, but very often I'm quite interested to know a little bit about the author. But why? If we look at a painting, do we want to know much about the artist? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But with books, it seems to be a bit more crucial. And I think the reason is that we're interested in the background because we're looking for something which is authentic, which feels real, even though it may not be. Whether it comes from the person's own experience or an experience of somebody else that they've observed, we want to believe that they know how the characters feel in those particular contexts, and the way they respond is going to be genuine. I read an article recently written by one of the main publishers in the UK, and he said, we no longer sell books, we sell authors. I didn't like that idea, I have to say, because the author now, books are part of their PR exercise. And that explains why we see so many bad books going into something like the Booker Prize. They're interested in the author, not what they've written. But that depth of experience can change the way in which we feel, particularly when it's dealing with very difficult subjects. Now, over the last few years, it's become quite fashionable to write books that we call pathographies. Books written about somebody's illness or their process through treatment or whatever it may be. If you really want to get the feel of a pathography, read Fanny Burney's account from 1812 of having a mastectomy without anaesthetic. She was a wonderful, wonderful writer. And she had this awful, awful experience which she could not get out of her head, so she wrote it as a treatise. You feel, you hear, you smell everything that went on in that room while the operation was going on. A horrible, horrendous experience which takes you to the depth of what she felt on a physical and an emotional level. Most of the time, we want something that's a bit more cheerful, a bit lighter. But what does the choice of books that we make say about us? If we were to write a list of the books we'd read over the last year or two, would somebody come along and say, oh, now that's interesting. There's something going on here which tells me a bit about your nature, about your character. I wonder. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something. I want you to turn to the person next to you, say hello if you've not met them before, and I want you to talk about the last couple of books that you both read for pleasure. Not academic books, not informational books, books for pleasure. And does that give anything away about you as a person? Go ahead. 1 more minute. Okay. I hate to break up conversations, but I hope you've learnt maybe a little bit about yourself or about your neighbour. I hope you haven't been sitting next to someone who only reads murder mysteries where the killer always gets away. What about me? Some of my choices, they're very rational. So, for example, when I travel, I usually try and find a book, obviously translated into English, written by someone who lives in that particular place or region, to try and get an idea both of the culture but also the history and geography that goes behind it. Some are much more emotional. And it's those choices which usually have a long-lasting effect on me, that make me keep thinking about it again and again, where it never quite leaves me, where I have a sense of something, often, I have to say, a sense of loss or wanting to reach out, to aspire, to make up for that loss. With the exercise that we did earlier, thinking about the old man, that reminded me of a book I read years ago, written by Laurie Lee, called Cider with Rosie. You won't have heard of it, but it was written about a young boy growing up in a tiny village in the west of England before the First World War. And when you read the book, you have this tremendous sense of what was lost, of this age, this innocent age that went before so much trauma and trouble. And you come away feeling wistful. If only we could somehow reclaim what he was writing about. Memories, happy, sad, or imagined, are often triggered by what we read. Just a couple of weeks ago, I finished a novel that I was reading, and to my amazement, that night I woke up in the middle of the night remembering a very painful episode from my childhood. And something in the book had triggered that memory. I didn't want to remember it. I didn't want to relive it, but somehow it had focused my attention upon it, so much so that my subconscious broke out while I was asleep, and I had to face it. The subconscious pulls all of these stimuli together, making us wonder, why are we drawn to a particular type of book? And yet, as we've seen already in the conference, as Timothea in particular has been pointing out, there are fundamental issues which underlie stories, however they are told. Issues of identity, of loss, of seeking, aspiration, of potential danger, the triumph of good over evil. Why is it that we still talk about Greek myths 3,000 years later? Why is it that we read to our children fairy tales, folk tales, because they distill essential truths, Why do I go and watch Shakespeare on the stage? Because 400 years later, he is describing human nature in a way that nobody else has been able to do so well. Underneath it lie those same themes. A very famous film critic in the States was asked by a journalist to sum up the whole of Hollywood film in a single sentence. He thought for a moment and he said, America is a nation of little boys who have lost their father and they're trying to find him again. And he said, that is what you find in every Hollywood film. A little boy's search for his father. Wow. We're back to Greek myths. Phenomenal. And when I read that, I thought, I'm not so sure. And then I started applying it to every Hollywood film I saw. He was right. It's there. It's there. Underlying it. This yearning, this desire. We can't get away from them. Young, of course, loved this idea of the metaphors and the symbols and this unity underlying conscious culture and subconscious culture that would break out in every way that it could. Well, I've been talking about an intuitive process in reading, but what about writing? Those of us who write, we know full well the first rule of writing, write about what you know. It's a good rule. But clearly it's not always true. People write about relationships they've never had or broken relationships they've never had. They write about crime, which hopefully they've never experienced. They write fantasy, they write science fiction. All manner of things come out of the imagination, which may well rely on some level of fact, but nonetheless has to have a deep intuition there to be able to express it. We heard the word empathy earlier on this morning. Empathy is so important if we are going to write with our intuitions, because empathy is not the same as sympathy. And often when people talk about empathy, they mean sympathy. But empathy, by definition, is one of the most difficult things that we can do as a human being. We are trying to understand the situation of another person, not as me in that situation, but as them in that situation. That's incredibly hard. That's what empathy is really all about. And to do that, we need both information and inspiration. Any good author will combine the two. Graham Greene, phenomenal author, screenplay writer, and so on. He would do both. And so, an hour's drive away from here, he wrote the screenplay to what is still regarded as the best British film ever made. In 1948, The Third Man. And then he wrote a book out of the screenplay of The Third Man, which people perhaps know better. But as a Catholic, and as a struggling Catholic, his religion was never far away. It was always bubbling up. And he used to talk about the third man as the risen from the dead story. Well, there is a character who's supposed to be dead who isn't. That was why. And one of the great sadnesses of his life was, he said, for years, I have wanted to start a book in the same way. And I've never sat down and started writing. And he said, in my imagination, I'm walking down Piccadilly in London, one of the big roads. And in the crowds, I see the face of the man whose funeral I went to a month ago. He said, I've always wanted to start a book like that. He couldn't get away from the risen from the dead story. Struggling against his own feelings, his own beliefs, but nonetheless, bubbling away. Intuition is an awareness of cues without being able to rationally identify the source that they come from. In English, we speak about having a hunch. I'm sure there's a Slovak equivalent. Or we talk about having a gut feeling, a feeling inside us. We know that this is so, but we can't quite explain why we know it. Intuition is imagination guided by our senses, or allowing our senses to trigger the imagination, as we did earlier with the story of the old man. Now, how does this fit with a structure that we're told we're supposed to have when we write? Well, structures are important. Structures are there so that what we create is meaningful, flowing, intelligent, and can readily be accessed by somebody else. Structure provides the framework into which intuition fills in the pictures with our words. Structure provides the tools to tell the story that intuition inspires. The great Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez said, "Intuition is essential when you sit down to write." Intuition helps us to decipher a deeper level of reality. It brings an inner coherence. It's a sense of very deep knowing. It's a way in which we can immerse ourselves in another reality. Now, in a different context, I used to teach both medical students and postgraduate doctors how to use arts to influence their medicine. Paintings, literature, film, poetry. I had a ball. I hope they did as well. But there were some issues that are actually very difficult to teach because people put up barriers. Things like ethics, things like professionalism in particular. Very hard to teach without people switching off. But you give them examples in a film. You get them to think about a piece of writing, and before they know it, all their defenses are down and they're vulnerable to what you're trying to put across. Intuition, I always believed, was also important in medical practice, not as a form of laziness, as a shortcut. But there were some times when history, examination, investigation just didn't yield the truth. And there were occasions when I would have this gut feeling, no, this is wrong. Look closer and closer and closer, and then you find it. And I used to try and teach that approach to people, that if they felt uncomfortable about a patient, why? What is it? Is it your brain experiencing a mismatch in the information that's coming? If so, you need to listen to it very closely, because there will be something that you're going to find that will be important. The same is true in counseling. And often I found that in counseling people, breakthroughs came when I trusted my intuition. What was this person making me feel? I remember saying to one lady, she used to drive me mad, I'll be honest. Hated it when she came to see me. And one day I just, whether this was professional or not, I'll leave you to judge. But I said, you make me feel so frustrated. That's what I said to her. And I thought she was going to turn around and yell at me. Instead, there was a long silence, and she said, yeah, that's what I've been trying to put into words, and I've failed. I feel so unbelievably frustrated, I could scream. And I had picked up the emotion that she couldn't, acknowledge. I'm going to ask you to talk to your friend next door again. Not about a book. I'm going to ask you, when was the last time you had a hunch? You had a gut feeling. You acted on intuition. And what happened when you did? Please discuss. One more minute, please. Thank you. I hope you're able to carry on these discussions over lunch. Some of you will have learned to trust your intuition. Some will have learned maybe you can't trust it quite so well. Some years ago, I was working for a short time in southern India. And it was in the days when it was before mobile phones or easy telephone calls and all the rest of it. And a telegram arrived. Gosh, telegram? Do they exist anymore? A telegram arrived. And it was from my wife, phone home, urgently. Well, you can imagine, my first thought was, who's died? And I went to see the hospital administrator and said, can I get a phone call back to England? And she said, well, you can, but we have to talk to about 5 different exchanges to line up the call to Bombay, where the international lines are. And it will take a long time, but I'll do my best. I said, well, I'm supposed to be on an overnight sleeper train tonight going to the coast. I'm going to do some traveling. And she said, well, I'll do my best. She came back to me later in the day and said, the phone call is at 6 o'clock. I'm supposed to be on the train at 6 o'clock. So she said, well, I book a call. Whether you're here for it or not is entirely up to you. And I thought, with a message like that, I have to stay. So eventually the call was put through. I spoke to my wife. After the usual greetings and everything, I said, well, what's the problem? What terrible thing has happened? She said, oh, nothing. She said, I just had this real strong feeling that I had to talk to you. And I said, well, that's really nice, but I'd spent weeks getting hold of these train tickets and I'd got all this traveling lined up and I'm not going to make the first train now. And that's it. And I hope I was as gracious as I should have been. The following morning, I got up and somebody greeted me. And they said, have you heard the news? I said, no. And he said, the train that you should have been on, an express train collided from the other direction and a third express train ploughed into it from the back. There are at least 800 people dead. I would have been right at the back of that train where the express ploughed into it. You won't be surprised that I've got that ticket framed on my wall at home. I asked her a few weeks ago, I said, why did you send that telegram? She said, I've no idea. She said, I just knew I had to speak to you and hear your voice. Well, I said, if you didn't, she acted on her hunch. If intuition is to be reliable, we have to train it like a muscle. How do we do it? Observation. That's the first thing. You look, you listen, you experience your senses, you take note of them. Solitude, which is increasingly difficult to find in this death by internet world. Creativity. Being open. Allowing, if you're writing a story, to speak for itself. And then questioning the ideas in the imagination that pop up. Guiding the imagination where you can, a bit like a snowboarder going down the snow. Allowing your mind to wander in dreams and daydreams. Being curious. All of this will help the conscious and the subconscious to bring things to your attention in a way that you'd not experienced before. And I believe can help whatever form of work or exercise or pursuit we're involved in. Now, the language of children is storytelling. Storytelling, as we've already heard, is so vital because it transmits wisdom, it celebrates life, it helps us to overcome problems. Some people wonder whether we should be sharing difficulties with children. Well, adults, they read all sorts of difficult things, including pathographies and exploring painful things in the books that they read. But it's now becoming much more common, certainly in the UK, for books to be written for children exploring difficult subjects. There are a lot of comics, for example, that look at illness and look at loss. And where there are children who perhaps find books with too many words difficult to access, the comics can be very valuable. My research interest is in the representation of deafness and deaf people in literature and film. And so where these are explored, you get very powerful themes. Silence, loss, isolation, loneliness, exclusion, marginalization, the use of a different language like BSL, signing, different culture. But isn't that true for all children, especially any adolescent? That to a greater or a lesser degree, they experience all of the things that I've mentioned. It's just that in a deaf context, they experience them perhaps in a more profound way. And so there are lots of books which are written about deaf children, deaf adolescents. The Boy Who Made Silence is a wonderful book. It's a very dark book. El Defo is a very funny book. The title suggests it, El Defo, which is an autobiography of a young girl who grew up with deafness, and because she found difficulty in handling a social interaction in schools, she created this fantasy superhero figure called El Defo, who would appear whenever there was trouble and would sort out her problems. It's not surprising then that even the big comic companies like Marvel and DC, they all have deaf superheroes. Did you know that? Deaf superheroes, the most famous being a young lady called Echo, who only uses sign language of 2 different forms. I think of my own experience. I'm not deaf. But when I was 5, I went through an incredibly difficult experience. My older brother died. He was 12, I was 5. How does a 5-year-old understand the death of their brother? There were no books, there were no comics, there was nothing that explored bereavement, loss, that sense. My parents could not talk about it. All they could do was weep. And so I could not understand on any level what was going on. And there were all sorts of emotional sequelae which came out of that, which I would say some of them are still there to an extent. And I've often thought since, if only there had been someone else or something else that I could have, if not talked to, at least I could have read their experience, I could have looked at a comic, I could realize I wasn't the only one. I wasn't alone. Somebody else was trying to make sense of this awful situation as well. Perhaps because of that, I don't know. I found it very difficult to engage with books, and I really didn't get into books until I was about 9 or 10. And then somebody gave me a couple of old books, and I don't know what it was, the cover or the title, and I remember I picked up one of these books. It was called The Castle of Adventure. Wow. Fantastic title. And I just started reading, and I didn't stop. I was switched on, and I suddenly discovered I could escape into this fantasy world, leaving behind the pain that I'd experienced for so long. There were annuals written like comics, and they also had a very special place for me because my grandparents used to have them in their house, and we would go and stay with my grandparents once or twice a year. And I would wake up early in the morning and go through looking at the pictures in these books. And the pictures were very similar to the pictures they had on the wall, as wallpaper in my bedroom. And it made me feel so safe, so secure. My happiest times as a child was when I was at my grandparents'. When I became an adult, I found every single copy of those annuals dating back to 1936, because the pictures were so powerful for me. So should we approach difficult things for children? The answer has to be yes, but done with care, done in a way that is not provocative, that is not painful, in a way that's accessible. How far do we take it? Well, there are all sorts of difficulties and issues that life can raise in different ways, and sometimes we don't know how much children are thinking about them. It has been shown, for example, that representation for deaf children in books and comics, if they read about children like themselves, it increases their emotional and educational development. There's a huge jump when they can identify with other deaf people or children that they read about. You can take that further. There's a lot of research now which shows that signing, you can teach signing to 6-month-old children, and we did this with my grandchildren. And at the age of 6 months, they can tell you whether they're hungry, whether they're tired, long before they can say their first word. And now there is a big move in the States, in Canada, in the UK to teach signing to as many hearing children as possible, because the educational development is increased right the way through their school lives. Fascinating. I have 4 grandchildren. I know I look so young it seems impossible, but I have. And 2 of them are black. Their father is, my son-in-law, has a Caribbean heritage. For children growing up in the UK, for most of them, colour is not an issue, race is not an issue. The only thing which anyone's ever said to my granddaughters is, "Why is your hair so curly?" They notice nothing else. And yet, my older granddaughter, who was, 6 at the time, who never talks about things like that, never notices the differences between people, or so I thought. We were talking about Prince Harry marrying Meghan Markle. And to my surprise, she looked up at me and she said, "Good," she said. "Now there's going to be a princess who will be the same colour as me." I was flabbergasted. I had no idea that she had taken note of those things at the age of 6. So yes, we should be exploring all sorts of issues, presenting differences, encouraging people to look at different things in a sensitive way. And I want to raise a question with you, and I hope the answer is overwhelmingly yes. I wonder how many times that Roma children are shown in Slovak children's books in a positive light. And I hope the answer is lots of times. If not, let's put a question mark there. Why not? Is there something that should be done about it? So yes, we can sensitively treat issues of illness, grief, race, social, education. But we need to be careful. Encourage people's aspirations, but in a realistic way. I don't know whether you have the same sort of television program here that we do in the UK. I always want to throw a shoe through the television set when I see it. It's called The X Factor. And the idea is that people who are completely unknown come before these judges and they sing or they dance or they perform or whatever. It sets people up to fail. And one thing when they talk to the people who go on it is they all say the same thing. "I have a dream." Well, dreams can be good. When I was younger, I had a dream to be 6 foot 6 inches. Did my dream do me any good? No. Dreams have to be put into the context of reality, and I'm not saying that we should squash aspiration, far from it. But aspiration has to go hand in hand with opportunity. And sometimes we have to help people with their dreams. Yes, if you want to do this, you have to study hard. You have to work hard. You have to train hard. You have to go for every opportunity you can. I was talking to a friend of mine at the gym. He's an international rugby coach, and I love rugby. So he and I often team up and talk rugby. And he said, I can spot a future international rugby player at the age of 12. I said, how is that possible? And he said, well, for 2 things. One is there is clear and obvious talent that just stands out, marks them out from everybody else. But he said the other thing is their attitude. A future international, I will say to the team, I want somebody to clean the boots. I'll do it. I want somebody to sweep the floor. I'll do it. I want somebody to play in this position. I'll do it. He said they've got talent combined with this desire. I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. So he says they make their own opportunities and they create their own luck. And I do want to encourage dreams in children, but it has to go alongside reality. The two have to go hand in hand. I want to encourage you to help children to dream, to escape, to overcome painful issues, to soar above the mediocrity of everyday life and aim for higher things. How do you do it? You may have heard of 2 18th century artists in England, one called Constable and the other called Turner. If you go to the National Gallery, you will find the National Gallery filled with Constables and Turners. Wonderful landscape artists, incredible. You haven't seen a sky until you've looked at Turner's skies. They are phenomenal. John Constable was a very well-balanced man. Turner, his contemporary, I'm afraid, was not. He always had a sense of inferiority. All came from his upbringing. And he was particularly jealous of Turner and of Constable. And so Turner pushed himself into the position where he was head of the Royal Academy in London, and he was responsible for choosing the paintings for the exhibitions and where they would be displayed. And he decided, I'm going to put Constable's picture here and my picture, which is going to be so much better, right next to it. So everyone can look at the two and think, Turner's is better. Just before the exhibition, he came into the doorway and he looked at and saw that John Constable had been painting into the picture things he didn't know were going to be there. And it was a set of guardsmen standing to attention with their red tunics. And as he stood 100 yards away from the pictures, all this line of pictures going down the gallery, immediately his eye went straight to Constable's. But Turner knew all about the psychology of vision 200 years ago. And what he did, he walked down the gallery, took a brush from an artist who was finishing off a picture, went up to another artist, dipped the brush in a pot of red, and went to his own painting, and he put a tiny spot of red into the middle of the sea. It was a seascape, tiny dot of red. And then he threw the brush down with a big smile on his face. because he knew that anyone who came into the exhibition, the moment they opened the door, their eye would go straight to that spot on his canvas. And now, if you go to the Tate Gallery, they have bought both paintings, they put them in the same room together, and when you walk in, it's absolutely right, your eye goes straight to this tiny spot of red, and you don't even notice that Constable has a painting sitting next to Turner's. Why do I tell you this? Because speaking to you as writers, as illustrators, as publishers, as librarians, as educators, you have the opportunity to make a mark that will direct the attention of a child in a particular way, to something so special, so valuable, so precious, that their life will never be the same again. Trust your intuition. Trust your inner guide, because it speaks with the voice of a child. Dakin.